Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. Named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today on October 31st, happy Halloween, 2025, I'm excited to welcome Rebecca Lowe to the podcast. She is a philosopher and a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. She does multiple things of note, including having been a space philosopher, which I do want to ask about. But she writes a Substack called The Ends Don't Justify the Means, which is wonderful. And she hosts a podcast, which is enlightening, called Working Definition. You should check both of those out. Today, we're going to be talking about freedom, definitions, mixing the philosophical stuff with the real life stuff, because that's really complicated. And even though I've been doing this for a really long time, it's still not always super clear. So I'm really excited about that. I hope that you learn a lot. I surely will. Welcome, Rebecca, to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Juliet, for having me. Big fan. Keen to be here.
Thanks. So first question, what is the most important thing that young people should know that we don't?
Yeah, I mean, as a philosopher, these kinds of questions make me anxious. Questions with the word no in knowing something's a super high bar. I'm pretty skeptical about the kinds of things we can know. But I do get that you're not asking me, probably not asking me to give my kind of theory of knowledge. So I'll try and give an easy answer. Albeit I'll just I'll do one more bit of couching also, which is something like, my guess is you're saying what's a bit of advice that I think would be useful for younger people than me, in terms of maybe pursuing a good life or things going better for them or something like that. Some bit from my hard-won 40 years that I can pass on. And the first thing I'd say is something like, I strongly believe that there are many ways to live a good life. So what's important to one person might not be important to another. And that's not just a subjective thing. I think it's the case of the matter in some important objective way. Nonetheless, if I were to have to think really hard, and I did this morning, think hard about whether there was something that I could remember, some moment when somebody told me something or I realized something, and I thought, man, if only I'd known that sooner, and if only the education system had some way to impart this. I think it would be something my dad told me when I was a kid. So actually, I wasn't so much of a kid. I was a teenager, and I was reading some complicated book. I actually remember who it was by. I don't remember which book it was. It was by Edward Said. He was this very complicated thinker. And I was getting very frustrated because I was trying really hard and I just couldn't work out what the argument was. I couldn't work out really how he got to his conclusions. I just was getting very frustrated. And my dad was there and I said, look, I just can't work this out. Have you read this? Do you know what the answers are? And he said, look, I'll talk with you about it. But just remember, sometimes when you've worked really hard on something and you've tried to work it out, maybe it's not you. Sometimes it just doesn't make any sense. And I think we all know that as kids about certain things. We know when someone's talking complete nonsense. But it can be harder when you're a kid to feel like you've got the authority when you're reading something, particularly some scholarly tome. You're happy to say the novel is rubbish. But the scholarly tome, when you're a teenager, oftentimes if you can't get anywhere with it, you think, I'm not smart enough, I haven't worked hard enough. No, sometimes it's just not. It just doesn't make sense. I think that's really, really important advice.
Me with Hegel.
Yeah, absolutely. Life is too short to read Hegel. Tried. It's too short. Even the good exegesis of Hegel, people like Brandon, it's too long. It's too long. There's too much of it.
So, okay, I mean, given that you study in part what people have thought and what people have written, and you do analyze the merits of people's arguments as part of what you do from day to day, I kind of wonder about this, where I want to say as easy as an idea, as easy as it is to communicate something, as much as you can distill it, that is the merit. Like, the more people there are that have to study what someone said in order to be able to effectively translate it, even if it's not like language to language translation. Or it's so complicated that even though it is in English, it is actually its own language. That's just a very clear sign that it's not worth doing. But then you read something like, I don't know, the Bible, and there are so many people who study the Bible, or Adam Smith. And to me, those things are pretty simple to read on their own, and yet it still helps to have people to help further distill, translate, explain, make colloquial. What is the line there?
So I think there's some easy things like, look, if you're reading a book in a foreign language that you're not very good at speaking, imagine you've got some aptitude, but you're not very good at it, then you might need more help. Or there's a book where it's in a language you just don't speak at all, then you're definitely going to have to appeal to a translator unless you want to miss out on it. Similarly, something which has some high degree of technical knowledge from a field that you just don't know that much about. There are those kinds of simple cases where that kind of translatory work, you need to outsource or you need to bring in some mediator. I think within philosophy, I'm a big fan of clear, simple prose, people making their arguments as clear as possible. I have a bit of a funny position on this stuff, largely in that I do try to take arguments separate from the people who made them. I try to, I guess. So, for instance, I thought quite a lot about Locke's arguments when I was writing my PhD thesis, but I was very keen to make it clear even that I wasn't really that interested in Locke as a historical person who lived. I was just interested in his arguments. So I try to be as ahistorical as possible, I guess, is what I'm saying. But that still doesn't really answer your question, because it's still, if I want to think about his arguments or your arguments, there's some sense in which I have to understand those arguments before I evaluate them. So I do think an important part of doing philosophy is working out what the argument is that you're evaluating, perhaps making some objections to. I think it's important to do that clearly and charitably. So I work really hard to, particularly if it's an argument I disagree with, to come up with a charitable formulation of it. Although then again, that might not actually have been the intentions of the person I'm engaging with. So it's a complicated one. But for me, I'm most interested in considering arguments about important things. I'm probably a little bit less concerned about who made them or whether I'm really presenting them as they intended them. I want to engage with the strongest version of the argument, and I'm happy to pass that off as an act of charity. But sometimes it might actually just be me recognizing their argument isn't that good, but here's a better formulation of it.
Steelmanning is always, I think, better than straw manning, especially 100%. If you're the route of trying to figure out what the truth is. So this is kind of somewhere where I struggle, because I do really love this. Take the charitable version. You don't really have to think about who said it and why. But in the same way as there are multiple ways, as you said, to live a good life, there are multiple ways to analyze what someone said and why. And there's a point where you can't really take someone's argument without understanding where they come from, or without missing out on something. Or it's just maybe a different method of analysis. And I don't know, maybe there is merit to complicated ways of putting things that I just don't prefer. But there are multiple ways of doing it. And it seems like it's kind of this mess as anything where it's easy to say there are multiple ways to live a good life. It's easy to say simplicity over complication. Mm-hmm. But then when you get down to practically applying this, it seems really difficult to me, because you have to put yourself in a box at some point where you have to decide, I am going to just take the argument, I'm not going to take the person, or I'm going to try to blend those, or I'm going to only look at the person.
Yeah.
And it almost seems to me that we're always taking some approximation of what the truth is in what they've said, who they are, what the merits of their arguments are, what they mean, what the implications are. How do you actually get to the truth then?
I mean, this on some level comes back to my skepticism about knowledge on some level. There's a difference between believing there are truths of the matter and thinking, therefore, you have, access to those truths. It also comes back to something you said at the end of, I think, your response to my response to the previous question, which is if what you're doing is seeking the truth or something. So I think the truth that I would generally be seeking when I'm analyzing somebody's philosophical argument is whether there's some truth that they managed to reach through their argument, as opposed to the truths about what their reasons were for making the argument or where they were at the time when they were making the argument, those kinds of historically contingent, kind of contextual things. Partly because I believe in a division of labor, like the biographer or the historian might just be better at doing that stuff than me. Or maybe just, we can't spend our lives doing all of the things, so we come to some kind of, coordination over these matters. There are many philosophers who have totally different views on this. So actually, if you think about the more kind of, and some of these distinctions aren't very clear cut, but more kind of continental stuff, particularly more postmodern stuff, there are many people who think that flowery, complicated language, which you and I might just find, or certainly I think I sometimes find too much. I just want to know what the argument is. Guys, drop all the words, give me the argument. They're like, no, look, the thing we're talking about is really, really hard, and we can't reach it that way. Or it's really hard to reach it that way. So here's an alternative way, which is, here is a beautiful text. There's a beautiful text with complicated language. And if you read it and you're fully inside it, you're going to have some different kind of routes to knowledge, a bit more kind of akin to seeing a beautiful painting. I mean, I kind of get what they're trying to do there. It's not my preferred route to trying to get, certainly not to getting philosophical knowledge. But I can see that they're doing something different and they're happy about doing something different. So yes, to that extent, I agree with you that sometimes there are just different kinds of things going on. And if you try to analyze it as the kind of thing which is doing X when actually it's trying to do Y, you're setting yourself up for failure. And maybe it's not being charitable. Maybe we just have to say it's a different approach. And the methodology we'd use to analyze the first thing isn't so applicable to the second thing. Sad times.
I'm going to bring in the focus of your podcast briefly. Working definition, coming to a definition of a concept or an idea or a word that's important in modern discourse, which I love. It's just so easy. It's like little bites of important things.
Thank you.
The thing that is complicated about this is in your example of using the flowery language, I would almost argue that that is not the same type of philosophy, or that it might not even be philosophy. Yeah. I am a living walking contradiction, because I love efficiency. I love econ. I love things to be as simple as possible. We take the hypotenuse, the shortest path to get us from point A to point B, which usually is along A to C instead of A to B. No, or I said that wrong, but whatever. Anyways, too complicated. Let's not do that. But on the other hand, I love the existentialists. I think that phenomenology, where you're using the language and the color and the descriptions of the mug that you're drinking coffee out of, actually gets at something really important that cannot be distilled, right? So I guess, in a sense, I agree with the people with the flowery language, except I consider those two fundamentally different things. And I don't know, maybe they just are differences in types of philosophy and methodologies and whatever you want to call it. But at what point does that become an entirely different thing? At what point does the adjective that you attach to anything change what that something is, so that what you're doing and what flowery text philosophers are doing are, how different is that? When does it become different, and when is it important to know why they're different?
Wow. I mean, so on some level, you're asking, I guess, this question about how do you define something? When does something count as a concept? I mean, so one simple answer, it is a big question, and there are many different ways to do that. I mean, so one simple answer is just that these people are just doing philosophy in different ways. There is more than one way to do philosophy, in the same as there's more than one way to live a good life. You could say still there's some central activity that's going on, some central goal that is being sought, depending on whether you want to take a kind of stipulative approach or some kind of teleological approach or something like that. you could say something like, hey, all these people agree that philosophy is, the pursuit of truth, which you mentioned early on. There's another approach, though, where you could just say, no, actually, some of these people don't think philosophy is about the pursuit of truth. They think it's about making clever arguments, or they think it's about getting a job. I mean, of course, you could on some level reduce those things down to pursuing truth, because it's like, how do you find truth by doing those things, or what are the truths of the matter about those things? I'm generally just quite happy to take quite an expansive view about what philosophy is and what doing philosophy is. I find it quite funny sometimes. There's this general view that everyone's a philosopher. People often say that, don't they? There's a very niche view within academic philosophy that some people hold, which is only about 3 or 4 people in the world are doing philosophy or are count as philosophers. They are at 1 or 2 universities. They focus on 1 or 2 subjects.
And they may or may not include the people making those arguments in their mind.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So I think that's a very good point. Some of that speaks to a deep self-consciousness amongst some philosophers. Because being a philosopher, it sounds very grand. Some people have some anxiety about affording that status to themselves. But I tend to take a bit of a middle road. I think philosophy, doing philosophy, being a philosopher, those are slightly different things, but they capture something which is the same. I think it's about applying certain kinds of methodologies to certain kinds of questions in the pursuit of certain kinds of things, something like that. The specificity is at the level, some degree to the methodology, some degree to the kind of question. There's a history of philosophy, like you said, some work within being a philosopher is thinking about the arguments other people have made. So even though I like the historical thing, I think it makes sense for me to read other people's arguments. If I'm trying to solve a really important philosophical question myself, I actually try not to read other people's arguments before I've come to some view myself, if it's something I don't already have a view on. But nonetheless, if I want to be more efficient, or if I want to kind of check my answers, I'm then going to want to compare it against things other people have said. So I have my preferences for sure about the styles of philosophy I like, and indeed the kinds of philosophical questions I find the most interesting. But I'm relatively happy just to say, those people are also doing philosophy, the flowery language people. It's not my preference. I don't think it's such a good route to trying to do that hard thing of searching out knowledge. But I don't think, at least on a practical level, there's much benefit to me saying they're not philosophers. And in this broader sense of people addressing certain kinds of questions, even in certain kinds of ways, there's going to be some overlap, which makes philosophy distinct from, say, economics or from, say, sociology or political science, even though, again, there are a lot of overlaps. I like doing what I think of as political and economic philosophy because I'm interested in using philosophical methodology to think about economic concepts, for instance. That doesn't make me an economist. There's still a difference between what I'm doing. So I'm largely happy within all of these little tight distinctions I'm trying to make to be, or at least claim that I'm being sufficiently expansive, that I'm not going to annoy all of those people who like to do philosophy in different ways from me.
I kind of like that, though. Then you can take a bunch of different definitions, right? There's the really strict academic definition. To be an academic economist, to have a PhD and a post teaching and doing research, or even just teaching, I mean, maybe there's a distinction between the two of those, but that is a type of being an economist. It is a different but equally valid, if weighted differently, type of economist to do what you do, right? You're a casual economist. You approach it with maybe from a different place with philosophy, but you are still thinking about the economy and economics.
I just don't do regression analyses, right?
Yeah. Well, and some people consider those people who don't do regressions not to be economists, but in a sense they are. And I think I tend to prefer the expansiveness, but when is that bad? I know earlier we were talking about barriers to entry and kind of exclusivity being a good thing in some cases, despite us freedom-loving people thinking that it's not necessarily so great.
So one cost would be as if we couldn't talk about
being an economist and being a philosopher. It seems valuable to have these distinct concepts, even if they have some blurring around the edges. And sometimes philosophers are doing economics and sometimes economists are doing philosophy. I was just reading a load of Milton Friedman. I went to a Milton Friedman conference over the weekend. Most people are going to agree he's an economist. He's doing philosophy a lot of the time. I think it's useful to be able to have these different terms, philosophy and economics. So if we don't have some barriers, we can't. That's right. We can't distinguish things. Then within that, there are some things where we feel sometimes people just say things like, hard to define it, but you just know it when you see it. Love is a good example of this. People find it very hard to define love, but you generally know, or at least you think you have some idea between the difference of being in love with someone and not being in love with someone. You can be like, there's my neighbor who I've met twice and I find really annoying. I'm definitely not in love with them. Right? So you can do it just on that kind of level. And then you get the more formal sense, which you were talking about. I think when you said about being an economist and doing X and doing Y and being Z and being A, that's some sense in which you have some conditions that need to be met. The philosophers talk sometimes about necessary and sufficient conditions. We love those terms. I just use them in ordinary language and people think I'm a weirdo. And then there's these theories like family resemblance, these things, or like bundle concepts. You can't have the neat, or it's much, much harder to have the neat, necessary and sufficient conditions approach on some things. But you can say, look, it overlaps with this thing, but not this thing, but that thing overlaps with this thing. So there are different ways. And some of what I try to get at in my podcast, and I should say the main goal of the podcast really is just to get people doing philosophy. I think there are many philosophy podcasts, and a few of them I think really represent what it is to do philosophy. I want non-philosophers to listen. There you go, I'm making the distinction. To listen to my podcast and be like, oh, that's what those guys do. And some of that is, so I had my friend Josh Ober, who's a really excellent classicist and a philosopher and a political theorist, and he and I love doing the whole necessary and sufficient conditions thing. We basically spent 45 minutes doing that, and it was awesome. But then also I had my fantastic colleague and friend Tom Hernig on, who's an economist, and we talked about a different contested term, and we broadly came at it from thinking about his experiences as an economist, as a banker, and that's an equally good way, at least in the sense of there's more than one way to define a word. We can have our preferences over those, and I can give you a complicated spiel about why I think one route is better in a philosophical sense, or gets more purchase on the concept, as the philosopher might say. But I think they're both ways of doing philosophy.
I like that idea of purchase, right? How accurate is your regression? The way
the economist is back in the room. See, I pick up terms from my economist friends, and I love them, and I love this. Purchase is a great term.
I mean, that's the thing. Being able to pick and choose which definitions and boundaries you like, right? I might never be a philosopher, but I like thinking about necessary and sufficient things. I think it's an important component of economics. If you're going to model anything, right? It's just about thinking. And so there is kind of this overlap. And if you choose to borrow from other disciplines or from other people, you're effectively endorsing. You're voting with your mind. I might bastardize what economists say.
That's right. Your head.
Ideas.
If your mind is within your head, and your head is going from book to book, you're voting with your mind. I'm not sure your mind is in your head, but
Yeah. Okay. We don't have to get into that. That's like a whole different subject. But okay. So, to me, I'm pivoting a little bit, kind of. Freedom is expansive. I think expansive is good. I believe that people have agency. I do feel confident that people are good at discerning things, because wherever the mind is, people have them. That's part of how I define humans. Let me know if you disagree with any of that, or if you need to add anything.
So expansive is good. I think it depends. I think expansive is good contingent on the thing. Expansive murdering is not good. So I want to say it's a kind of conditional claim. People have agency for sure. Yes, I think we all have the capacity for agency. Sadly, some people, you're in a coma, you can't exercise your capacity for agency. Some people, children, for instance, have less control over some of their actions, those kinds of points. But yeah, I think it's a basic human capacity and a really important, it's not just a kind of distinction between being a human and not being a human, or some kinds of other animals that might have agency, some aliens, for instance. It's also morally important. And then, yeah, I do think we're good at discerning things. I'm with Adam Smith on that. I think we all have the capacity to pass good judgment, even if we don't always exercise it, and even if we have to practice it to get better at doing it.
So then, what is your definition of freedom, and why is it good if it's good?
Wow.
Easy question.
Great question, yeah. So I did a podcast on this, one of my working definition episodes on freedom. I talked a lot about this. My guest was Tyler Cowan, my friend and colleague at Mercatus. We have quite different approaches to defining things, to thinking about freedom. I think one view I have, which I talked a little bit about in that podcast, I have quite, I think, a controversial view, which is I do think it's always valuable to do things freely. So one reason that view is controversial is because it commits me to saying that there's some good that obtains even when somebody freely does something horrible. So you freely torture the cat. Sorry, that's an awful example. Everyone is always telling me I shouldn't use these awful examples. I love your
Better than
cat.
murder, you know?
Well, I don't know. Some people want to debate that. But
yeah, some people, okay, just for the purpose of we're cutting costs. We're not talking about torturing humans.
Doesn't come cheap.
Rough approximation.
So if I'm saying that there's always something valuable in doing something freely, then I'm committing myself to saying there's something valuable in doing something freely that's horrible. The reason I think it's okay for me to say that is I think I can separate out and doing that boundary thing again, doing something freely and not doing something freely. So I think the value can obtain at that level. I don't think it has to be contingent on the value of the thing. So I don't think I'm making any claim at all about how valuable or non-valuable it is to torture the cat. When I say some value obtains at the level of doing the thing freely, torturing the cat freely, that's a horrible thing to say. And like I say, these examples sometimes annoy people, but will make them upset. But I actually think if you have the example that makes the person upset, sometimes it's because it's doing the work.
I like that. I agree. Even though I don't love the thought.
Makes you unpopular. It makes me unpopular. But I think, sometimes I'll take the cost. I'll bite the bullet. I'll do the thing.
Did you not decide to be unpopular when you decided to pursue philosophy?
Pretty much. But I think I was already had that kind of disposition. So I just get used to it.
So what do you... Okay, so I guess if you can define and determine what is doing something freely and something not freely, I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, they talk a lot about how even though you're quote unquote free and you choose to do something, how actually you've been coerced in some sense by someone. And so I think you kind of have to go and define, like, if we're going to talk about free and not free, then what is being coerced to do something versus not? Like, in a way, there's a value to doing things freely, but we still haven't defined what freedom is.
Yeah, you're right. I hedged on that. So I do have a view. My view is basically, I think I'm happy to say that being free is being able to do things of your own accord. Some people want to say that's too metaphysical. It's too much about philosophy of action, what it is, at some internal level. But I think it's a capacity on that point. I think I'm in line with someone like John Locke, who thinks that it's important in that sense of being something distinct about us, but also morally important that we can reason on things, we can deliberate, we can make choices, and then we can act on those choices. Doing that stuff is doing stuff of your own accord, something like that. I think if you're doing something freely, you're doing it of your own accord. If you're not doing something freely, if you're doing something not of your own accord, then you're not doing it freely. You're then going to say, what do you mean by of your own accord? And this is where we're going to come into some of these coercion things. So some of the thinking I've been doing lately about free speech, which I like to think at the level of speaking freely. So I think we can use that as an example of doing things freely, which is broadly what I'm trying to bring this freedom conversation around to. I thought about I have a little taxonomy of ways in which you can think about what's going on when someone can't speak freely. So when you might want to say something like, is it to do with them not doing it of their own accord then? So some instances, and this is not very exhaustive, but I think it's useful, some instances you can't speak freely because you just don't have the capacity to do it. The evil demon determines the content of all of your utterances. Or you've got a broken jaw, so you can't utter words at all. That's one type. Another type is you do have that capacity, but you just don't have the opportunity to exercise it in terms of communicating with either generally or with some particular person. So the evil demon isn't controlling the content of my words and my jaw isn't broken, but I want to speak to you. I really want to speak to you particularly, but you're in a different country and I don't have a mobile phone. There's some sense. Or I'm in the forest and I can't speak to anybody. Or I'm locked in a box because some evil guys come and locked me in a box. I still have got the capacity. I can still utter the words and determine the content, but I can't use that capacity. I can't exercise it in this kind of mode of prime importance for speaking freely, which is communicating. And then there's a third sense in which I can do both of those things. I've got the capacity to speak freely and I can exercise it, but I don't because of some expected costly consequence. So that's largely, I think, where we get into coercion. And I think thinking about it in these ways can help us to avoid some Casper errors. I think it can help us to think about different kinds of constraints. It seems to me like these are three very different kinds of constraints, although sometimes it's quite hard to determine exactly what's going on. But the point about somebody coercing you that I think is really important to note is they can only coerce you if you do have the capacity to do the thing. And you have the opportunity to exercise it. If you put the gun to my head and say, Rebecca, if you don't say economics is greater than philosophy, I'm going to shoot you. I can only do that if I'm free to do it in the sense of having the capacity and the opportunity to exercise that capacity. The reason I don't do it is because I think you're going to shoot me. It's a different kind of constraint.
Yeah, so there are so many ways to go here.
Sorry, I said too many things.
No, it's good. I want to point out the thing that you said it pretty early on, and then I think this is, at least in my mind, where the level of more detail comes in is one of the earlier, more high level things you said was like, there's the deliberation bit. Mm. So there's, I don't know. I just love people being able to think about things. And it's not even that you have to think about it for a long time. It's just that you are discerning.
Yeah.
You know in 2 seconds whether the lion is going to jump at your head and try to bite you, or someone's going to puts a gun to your head and like, do you believe that it's loaded or not? I don't think it takes a lot of time, but I think that does a lot of work. Maybe that's just because I really like that aspect of humans. And so I think that that's important to almost anything. But I guess what this gets into, right, if we keep going with the example of, are you free to do it if someone has a gun to your head?
Mm-hmm. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's an important sense in which you're not free. It's just a different kind of sense of not being free than the kind of sense in which you don't have the capacity or you don't have the opportunity to exercise it.
And I don't want to necessarily say that like living and like not dying or not being murdered, maybe more strictly, and being able to say exactly what you want in any given moment are the same. But what are the different senses of being free then, right? So in this example, being a libertarian, there's the natural right, positive right, negative right, right? Someone not hurting you and killing you is really important, very strict. There's way more that comes in when you say positive rights. So I don't know if that's necessarily the only distinction or the most important distinction or what you're thinking of, but what are the different types of freedom, senses of freedom, and how are they connected to each other, and when are they relevant?
This is a great question. So some people on our kind of side, the freedom side, are very attached to what they think of as these negative freedoms, or this sense of defining freedom in terms of the classic examples are freedom as non-coercion, which we already talked about. Freedom is non-aggression. Freedom is non-domination. We have these kinds of understandings. I think for all I think those things are important. I think sometimes conceptions of freedom or understandings of what it is that freedom is and why freedom matters, if you don't center the person for whom freedom matters, the person who can do free things, I worry something's missing. So I like to take what I think of as a kind of agent-focused understanding of freedom. One example I gave in the podcast I did, something like, I don't think it makes sense to say that Belgium is free or Belgium isn't free. We all know what I mean if I say that, right? I mean something like their laws are too restrictive, but Belgium isn't the kind of thing that can be free in this action sense. The question is, are the laws so restrictive that the people in Belgium can't behave in some free manner? So I think when we say something like freedom is non-coercion, believe me, I care a lot about people not being coerced to do things. But I'd want to say something like, what are they being coerced from doing? Why is it important that they shouldn't be coerced, as opposed to something that doesn't have the capacity from doing things freely being coerced? It doesn't make sense to talk about the stone being coerced, and that's because the stone doesn't have the capacity to do things freely. So one person I think who did a pretty good job of pointing out some of these connections, which I think you were also getting at, is this guy Gerald McCallum wrote a paper where he talked about most discussions of freedom are triadic. So they involve an agent being free or not being free from some constraint to do something or be something or have something. And I think generally when people talk about freedom as non-coercion, they mean something like somebody is being coerced from doing something. So all of a sudden, this heavy divide between negative and positive, being constrained from doing something and doing the thing, are kind of tied together. I think more generally that negative positive talk sometimes is unhelpful. So a lot of it comes from Isaiah Berlin. I think when he talks about negative and positive freedom, he means quite specific things about intentions behind government action, that kind of thing. I think that's important. But I think it sometimes is reduced down to an overly simplistic way of talking about what freedom is and why it matters.
So something that is striking is that we can go into these rabbit holes, foxholes, however many, hole in the ground, giant hole in the ground, hobbit hole, not referring to anything specific here, of definitions and details and what has purchase, what is most descriptive, blah, blah, blah. And then at every level of definition, you can get more granular, but even when you have the perfect mix of granularity and accuracy, at truth-gettingness, capturingness, then there is always another level of real-worldness. There's always another dimension. There's always another word or constraint or getting rid of a constraint, which then complicates things that you can add. And so how do you ever make sense of anything? I know we just have to live anyways, and that's part of just like cost benefit. We can think about these things, but then you have to live in the real world. But how do you think that this helps? I'm asking you to justify effectively your whole job and your whole being. But where is the line between when this is useful and how it affects our everyday lives, and how much of it is just kind of semantic? Because we have to survive anyways, whether or not we...
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. So I think I'd say a couple of things. One, the reason why philosophers, or at least why I like to think I'm thinking about the words, is because I want to understand the concepts beneath. I want to think about what it is people mean when they use these terms. Sometimes terms are really important on a social level. there are some important matters about which if we can't talk coherently, clearly, know what each other's meaning, then we're in trouble. If you and I don't have some similar, vaguely similar understanding of the word help, I can't know that if you shout help to me that I need to go and see what's going on, and you're in trouble, right? So there are certain words which have that kind of social value. So I'd say the goal of all of this stuff isn't just at the level of the semantics. It's not just at the level of the words. It's to understand truths about the world about us, about what it is to be a human in the world. But yeah, there is a big risk in a kind of over specialization, a kind of going down, like you say, to the granular. And sadly, there is a lot of that in philosophy. If you read a lot of articles in contemporary philosophy journals, it's people responding to points in footnotes, which were responses to points in footnotes, which were responses to points in footnotes. And you might, if you're a cynic, say, even if they're finally going to get at the truth of the matter about the point in the footnote, by the time they do, it's just less important. Maybe that's unfair. Again, it comes back to your point about, what should you spend your time on? What are the important questions? What are the truths that you should be seeking? You can't seek all of the truths. There are truths about, how many grains of sand there are at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, which nobody may ever know. Maybe we don't even have the capacity to know. Do those truths matter? Or what about truths about our people being tortured in some faraway country? Those truths matter too. They matter in different ways. So you've got to pick your battles. And the best philosophy can do is give us some tools at doing that. Then it's up to us to use that power of discernment that you talked about so eloquently in order to not waste our time on Earth, right? It seems to me luxuriant if you're using your skills to just while away your time or try to get jobs because that's the way that other people are doing philosophy or whatever it is. It's a privileged thing to be paid to think about stuff. And that comes with some quite serious obligations, I think. I sometimes think, if I just didn't have those feelings about these obligations and the fact that this is a privilege, I would spend all of my time thinking about what time is. I'm very interested in what time is. But I actually think it's better for me, at least at this point in my life, to spend my time thinking about stuff like freedom and rights and equality, because I think those things do have more of that purchase. They're equally interesting. And maybe if I had to be forced to think about it, maybe I'm slightly less drawn to it, although I'm very, very drawn to it. But I can just spend some of my free time thinking about time. And I can focus most of what I think of my working time, which I actually basically just think of as all my time because I love my work and I don't want to go and do other things in the evening. I want to think about philosophy and read philosophy. But my main output, I want to be on these things that I think are more socially valuable, at least that I think I can help to push the dial on in ways that are socially valuable. I don't mean that knowing about what time is isn't socially valuable. I just think in terms of me spending my time, at least at the moment, I think I can do more socially valuable work thinking about what rights are and what freedom is than if I spend all of my time thinking about what time is.
Which is cool.
Yeah, I think so.
He thought about that. Well, he kind of just showed people that it's freaky, I think.
Sorry, who did?
Salvador Dali, the artist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I love that. He's great. Very cool.
So, tangentially related, not quite properly quoted quote that I will begin to end us on.
Yeah, sorry. I should say I've just realized what time it is, and I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
No, but it's okay. I will be done in like a minute. I was told once, and this doesn't really have to do with you weighing the costs and the benefits of doing one focus of philosophy versus another necessarily, but I do think it is tangentially related. And I just love this, and I can't stop thinking about it. It's something about using, if you don't have to fight for freedom, what you do in that time is what it means to be free. Like, we fight for freedom to do the things that you might not necessarily do if all you had to do was fight for freedom. And some people still want to fight for freedom, even if they have the freedom to do otherwise. But I think that becomes more of a individual preference. Now, that's very rough and not necessarily a very philosophical, well-defined statement, but it's something that I've been pondering for a few months. So let me know what you think of that. And also, what is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
Wow, great questions. The first one, I think I'd say doing something freely is different, or I'm wary of the risk of conflating freedom with desire. So I think sometimes people say things like, he couldn't speak freely, and what they mean is he couldn't say the things he wanted to say. If it's just at the level of the kind of first order base preference, oftentimes we decide not to do the thing that we want, and we do that freely. I want to eat the donut almost every time, but I decide I'm only going to eat the donut some of the time because I have the second order desire, which is not to get very, very fat. Similarly, there are good philosophers' examples of imagine the evil demon is controlling me, and all I can ever say is, I want the donut. But sometimes I've decided that I don't want the donut. Somebody offers me a donut, the evil demon makes me say, I want the donut. There's a level on which I do want the donut, but it's not what I've decided to say. So I think something like speaking freely isn't just saying what you want to say, it's uttering the things that you've decided to say. This comes back to your point about discernment and deliberation. So I think freedom and desire are different things. They're both valuable. On the thing about what's something I've changed a belief on, I mean, I'd like to try to, there's a thing in philosophy called doxastic voluntarism. This is a whole big question about whether we can choose our beliefs, whether we have power to control what our beliefs are. Can you change your belief about something? I find thinking about this thing very interesting. I do believe that you can kind of condition yourself in certain ways. If you hang out with just the people who have one kind of belief, you might be more likely to come to believe it. Nonetheless, we do change our beliefs about things, and it's partly through that process of deliberation. There are interesting questions about how all this works. I believe strongly people don't value sufficiently things like U-turns. So oftentimes people say, I don't like such and such a politician because they're always making U-turns. I would far rather that they U-turned if the thing that they had previously been committed to was wrong. So it's a kind of, again, a conditional or a contingent thing. You should U-turn if the thing's wrong. I'd rather change my mind and be right than continue being wrong. One thing I constantly am changing my mind about is eating meat. I think it's morally bad and morally wrong for various reasons. I don't seem able to stop eating it. I have done for some time. So I try to tortuously go through in my head whether that's okay. One other thing I've changed my mind about is these different justifications for punishment. So the two most famous ones are kind of a deterrence justification and a retributivist justification. I used to have a lot more time for the deterrence justification, but came to the conclusion it was justified by consequentialist reasoning. And I think consequentialist reasoning is bad and wrong. I read some of the more sophisticated retributivist theories, and for some time I thought maybe there was something there, but I just fundamentally opposed them for various reasons. So I've come to believe that I think there's a kind of defensive or self-defensive justification sometimes, at least that can be a response to bad action and to crime. Don't necessarily want to say it's punishment. I think it's different from punishment. So I think you can put someone in prison for defensive reasons that are non-punitive, that kind of thing. So it's something I'm constantly thinking about, and I've changed my mind on various times.
Well, thank you so much for answering my question more than once, and for taking the time to share your wisdom, your thoughts, your definitions with us. I've learned a lot, and I know my listeners will as well. So thank you.
No, thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guests for their time and insight. I'd also like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. It means a lot. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests, or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at greatantidote@libertyfund.org. Thank you.